let's bring in attorney Jami, Floyd, and jury selection consultant Richard Gabriel, president of Decision Analysis, Inc. and the American Society of Trial Consultants Foundation. You know, it would seem to me that life in prison, especially when you're as young as Jodi Arias is, would be a much sort of stiffer penalty than the death sentence. But, Jami, you made the point yesterday that the death penalty is supposed to be for extraordinary cases. I think of Timothy McVeigh. Do you think that this case, in which a woman killed her husband, essentially, meets that criteria for extraordinary criteria?
Well, I knew if I kept coming back here day after day, you would eventually ask me this question that I was trying to avoid.
Oh, sorry.
And the reason I've been trying to avoid it is because I think my answer will be fairly unpopular. I do not think that this is a death penalty case. It's a horrific case. And I do think that she was death eligible. The jury was right to find that this was a cruel case, and that was the first stage of the penalty phase. But now the question is, should she be put to death? Does she qualify? And you mentioned Timothy McVeigh, where 168 people lost their lives, including a number of children in a daycare center there on the first floor of the Murrah building. And we can think of a number of other cases of terrorists, of people who've committed treason. Those are the kinds of people I think we reserve the death penalty for. And if we want to think of lesser crimes, serial killers, people who've horrifically murdered children, more than one child, in fact. Not this one case of a woman who murdered her lover. It's horrible. The way he died was horrible. But if we're going to have this extraordinary penalty, we have to think very carefully about how we employ it and why we employ it. Is it a deterrent or is it retributive? And it's supposed to be deterrent, not retributive. And in this case, would Jodi Arias really do this again? She'd be in prison for the rest of her life. I think that would be punishment enough.
Yeah, very good point. And Richard, you're an expert at looking at juries, and rate this jury for us. Do you think that they would be sympathetic to the sort of argument that Jami's making? Do you think they will be sympathetic to Jodi and want to spare her life?
Well, when you spend time in jury selection in death penalty cases, it actually corresponds with what Jami says, because a lot of jurors are for the death penalty in principle, but when they actually have a person in front of them, the criteria gets raised because it becomes personal at that point. At that point, they do tend to apply a criteria which says if it's a child or especially mass murder situation, then they sort of say that's what meets my criteria. What's interesting is that there's been approximately 8,300 death penalty convictions in the last 40 years. Of that, only 2% have been implemented against women. And it's shown that actually in what they call more domestic situations, where a woman kills a husband or a boyfriend, that's when it is applied, but it's again rarely applied. And so the death penalty for a jury here is difficult and very personal, and some jurors may also be clinging to what we call residual doubt. In other words, if they say, boy, I think this is a first-degree murder, but there's an aspect of passion or second degree that's in there, they may have made an unconscious decision even in the first phase to say, I'm willing to go with first degree, but I'm not sure I can go all the way with the death penalty if we have to get there.
Now, Richard, you say most jurors are open to the death penalty. Of course, if the prosecution has done a good job in the questioning phase, it has probably gotten rid of any jurors who are categorically against the death penalty. I mean, that's something people forget, right? In these cases, we've been talking about how if there's a hung jury, you'll go to a second phase where you'll pick another jury. But either way, most of those jurors are questioned for whether they are open to the death penalty. So we're actually often picking only out of the 60% of the population that remains open to the death penalty, right?
Well, all the research actually shows that a death penalty qualified jury is more prone to actually both convict the defendant and also implement the death penalty. Less receptive to mitigation phase. So yes, the deck is stacked in their favor already. The thing that comes into play here is really that personal element, which happens to be the principle versus the personal. Are they really for it in principle, but gee whiz, there's this person in front of them and they're just not quite sure, and that's where the real question comes in. The other huge question here is how many jurors are opposing it. If it's just one juror, then sometimes the pressure of that 11 other jurors can necessarily influence that, and they can basically fold to pressure and convict.
Yeah.
If there's more than two, it's much harder, and let's face it, even the prosecutors may be hard-pressed if there's even more than that to even go back and retry the death penalty.
But it does
phase.
have to be unanimous. That underscores the fact that it has to be unanimous for death.
So,
Exactly.
Jami, since you've jumped in, let me ask you this question. Look, if a second jury is necessary, with a case as infamous as this, as widely reported as this, where are these people going to come from?
That's right. That's right. And that's something the prosecution has to think about. Do they spend the time, the resources, the money, all of the emotional exhaustion that both sides, but in particular the Alexanders, would have to go through with a second trial? And it's not the whole trial. Let's be very clear. The second jury only comes in for the penalty phase and only at the point after cruelty has been established. So they would only be deciding whether she lives or dies. But still, that's an extraordinary effort and expense on the part of the state. But how do you find those unbiased people? Are they out there? I don't think so.
Jami, Richard, thanks for being here.